You're watching us live from Johannesburg. We are CNBC Africa. We tell Africa stories. Now, South Africa reported over 21,000 new COVID cases yesterday, bringing the number of active cases to more than 195,000. Some 1.8 million South Africans have recovered, however, from COVID-19. Or have they? Really? Well, my colleague, Khomoto Modise, has that story.
Thank you so much, Godfrey. Of course, it's time for our COVID-19 corner here on CNBC Africa every Thursday. And today we've got a story that really affects most of us who have been laid off or have had to stop going to work, after contracting COVID-19. And getting back to work has apparently been quite a bit of a challenge for certain people. We are looking at something called long COVID. Now, this came out, the study came from the University of Stellenbosch Business School, where they are elaborating on long COVID, the effects that it's had in the workplace, and how some people working have been forced, to go back to work, apparently even when they are not completely well. Joining me is Professor Renata Schoeman, and she's the head of healthcare leadership at the MBA program USB. Renata, thank you so much for joining us. I think firstly, for the purposes, of those who may not have heard of long COVID, can you just explain what long COVID is? I saw some very scary symptoms here that you might want to go into.
Yes, so long COVID, we talk about it when the acute phase of COVID has resolved. So people are not acutely ill anymore, but they have symptoms that can linger on for in excess of 6 months. And those symptoms that we refer to is what we call brain fog or muddled thinking, difficulties with concentration, and just feeling mentally sluggish, together with severe fatigue and also even ongoing shortness of breath. Now, so the COVID can affect multiple bodily symptoms, but when after the acute phase the symptoms last is what we recall as long COVID. And studies show that it can affect roughly up to 30% of patients after they recovered from the acute episode.
That's very interesting because, we've gotten so accustomed to the 14-day healing period. And after that, you go to the doctor and get yourself cleared, of course, for COVID-19. But what are some of the challenges, Renata, that you've identified in your study in these workplaces where long COVID, so to speak, isn't being seen as a serious problem as it should be?
So it is not our own study specifically, but if you look at one of the international studies which looked at almost 4,000 individuals that recovered from acute COVID, some of them, up to 45%, 90 days after they recovered, they still experience difficulties working and only be able to work at 50% of their capacity. Where some of them, up to 22%, were still after 90 days not able to work at all. So we are now faced with people go back to work and there's demands on them, especially now with COVID, where there were so many retrenchments and people are so financially constrained in organizations that you really want to turn around every cent. People also now have to deal with, or organizations have to deal with, people not being able to function at full capacity. And organizations have the additional challenge that according to the law, they need to do reasonable accommodations. You're not allowed to discriminate against people on the grounds of medical or physical illness or disability. And organizations really now need to think, how are they going to review how they support employees returning to work in terms of employee assistance and wellness programs, sick leave policies, what reasonable accommodations they can do, and then also review how we are going to go about in terms of even if people need to look at temporary disability.
Sure. And those symptoms that you've, spoken of sound, really, really serious. Is there a reason why long COVID hasn't been recognized yet as reason enough for people to, be away or abstain for work from a period as normal COVID, as we've come to know, is seen? Why is it that long COVID isn't reason enough if I were to come, with a doctor's note, or if I were to come, send my boss an SMS and say I've got long COVID? Is there a reason why it's not reason enough?
I think there's 3 reasons. One, per definition, symptoms need to last longer than 6 months. Now, we only now, i.e. 12 months of research that can be done from the first COVID cases. So there's just not enough research to really have evidence-based information. The second thing is that there was not enough time for industry leaders, for the medical fraternity, together with insurance and healthcare funders to come together to work on policies and guidelines, which is evidence-based in terms of putting these processes in place. So it's pretty much a time factor still. And the third reason is, and I think that's what's making many employers maybe hesitant, is unfortunately there's always people that will abuse the system of flexible work hours, reasonable accommodations, because COVID, or especially the long COVID, is another invisible disorder. So we have the same difficulties that we have with other mental health issues, where there's often a lot of stigma associated, but it's also not tangible, visible, and we can't really measure it specifically. And that's why it's so important that we actually do drive this process of getting criteria, diagnostic criteria, and guidelines in terms of how to approach it. But we do have some suggestions at this stage for organizations how to go about this.
And Prof, something that really jumped out at me when I was reading the documents that you have submitted to us is how 45% of the people that were, interviewed needed reduced work schedules, right? And in an economy like ours, is that wishful thinking to think that employers will be able to give those who, have long COVID more time away from work?
Yeah, I think that is one of the big challenges because there has been retrenchments. We do not have money to actually have people doing only 50% of what they can do. But we need to think long term in terms of retraining people and losing skills that we don't want to lose. This should be absolutely very high on the agenda for employers. But what we do recommend is that in the second month, so after a person has been ill from acute COVID, in the second month, you have the conversation with them. Do they still experience any symptoms? And then to work with them in terms of what accommodations is possible. And maybe it's just a change in hours to afford them maybe time to rest in the afternoon. They can work in the morning, work in the evening, if flexible hours is a rational approach depending on the type of organization and industry. The second thing that we say that if symptoms linger into the third month, it's really, really important to have a multidisciplinary approach where you do get psychiatrists, GPs, physicians on board, and specifically also with occupational therapists that can help the person reintegrate at work, but also to assist the employer in terms of how can we shift work around, how can we accommodate someone within the realms of the law as well.
And, finally, Prof, I hear you speaking about all the things that need to be done. Do you know of any work that our government is specifically doing towards recognizing long COVID?
At this stage, none that I'm aware of.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us. That is Professor Renata Schoeman, and she's the Head of Healthcare Leadership MBA program, USB. That was really insightful. I think I'd be very worried, Godfrey, if I were to have COVID longer than 90 days.
Fantastic interview there, Komoso. I actually was listening rapidly because I picked up two numbers that scare me. One, a fifth of all the workers who are going down with COVID-19 may not return to work, and 45% of those who go down with COVID may come back, if you like, with